Welcome to Real Talk, where I give real answers to real questions from real worship leaders. If you are a real worship leader with a real question and you want a real answer, head right here and submit your question for a future episode. Got some good questions this week? Let's talk about it. More meat means more muscle. Our first service starts at 9 a.m. What time should we start sound check with run through? I don't think I've ever been asked this question on Real Talk before, which is surprising because I've answered over 200 worship leading questions at this point. This seems like a very practical, logistical one that should have been answered before in the past. Here's what I think through whenever I think of when should my team show up on Sunday mornings to be prepared to lead worship. And let's just talk about what our teams need to do, at least what I want my team to do. I know some churches do things differently, and you kind of got to know your team and know what specifically they need to do. But here's what I want my team to be able to do before the church starts showing up on Sunday. First of all, I want them to be able to get there, and I want them to be set up and in their spots, which I point that out because that happens before the sound check and the run through. If they have an electric guitar, I don't have an electric guitar on my worship team, but if I did, I would want them to be there. I would want them to have their settings dialed in. Basically, I just want to have time for my team to be set up. And most of it is just, you show up and you plug in and you're ready. But for some people, it's not that way. So keep that in mind. The second thing is they need to grab their in-ears, so that's part of the setup as well. Everybody needs to grab their in-ears and their microphones and whatnot and make sure that they're ready to go for when sound check and run-through actually happens. And I didn't want to leave that out because sometimes I think that we forget to communicate that to our team and we say, hey, service starts at 9, show up at 8. And they show up at 8, but they're showing up at 8 and they're doing all of that stuff. And really what we mean to tell them is we need to be ready to go by 8 o'clock, not show up and get things set up at 8 o'clock, but we need to be ready to go at 8 o'clock. So just make sure to make that distinction with your team whenever you're communicating this to them. So that's the first thing they need to do. They need to be set up. The second thing that they need to do, if this is applicable to your worship team, is a sound check. And so you need to leave time for that. That shouldn't take too long to just do. People talk about sound checks in different ways. Sometimes it's just, testing the lines and make sure that they work, make sure like guitar play and we've got sound coming through, vocalists sing, we've got sound coming through. And then typically, at least the way that I've done it in my churches in the past, is that the sound person will mix as we're doing the run through. They aren't like two separate things, and I think that that's pretty normal in the church. But if you've got a bunch of different team members and you're switching things from week to week, then you will have to do a line check and make sure that everything's set up properly. So I just point that out to make sure that you have time for that as well. That might take 10 minutes or something. And then, and this is the part that everybody thinks about, is we have the run through. And even this depends on how you do it at your church. I'll share how I do it at my church. Some churches will just show up and maybe they have amazing musicians and they aren't even running through the whole song. Let's say you do 4 songs in your service. They'll just run through the beginning of the song and the end of the song. Some churches, and this is what I do at my church, is we run through every song from start to finish. Now, the extreme of that, even past what I do, is they will go through like a whole run through of their service, not just with the songs, but if somebody's coming up to speak on stage, they'll have them come up and they'll test things out and maybe, speak briefly to kind of, if they're doing announcements or something, to practice announcements or whatever. I've seen that happen in churches before. So I feel like even in this simple question, I need to define all these different parts. What's a sound check? What's a run through? It depends on how you want to do it at your church. With all of that in mind, here's what I do at my church. Our service starts at 9 o'clock. My team is in place and ready to go for a sound check / run through at 8 a.m. And when I say sound check / run through, it's really just the same thing. We just start going through the songs and the sound guys mix and make adjustments where necessary. So for my team members, that means that they have to show up 5-10 minutes early, depending on what instrument they're playing and how much they need to get set up beforehand. So then once 8 o'clock hits, and we're pretty good about this, once 8 o'clock hits, then we're all up on stage, we're gathered together, and I do a quick run through verbally of the service. I say, Patrick, you're going to start playing keys at the beginning. I'm going to read scripture. I'll lead into the first song. Then this person's leading the first song in the key of C, and then we're going to go right into the second song in the key of B or whatever. I don't know if you would go from C to B. That would be kind of weird, but I walk through the service like that. That way we're all on the same page. And they already know this. I just like to reiterate it to them so that we're all on the same page. And then from there, we run through the songs from start to finish. If there's something we need to work on quickly, we'll go back and work on it. But hopefully by Sunday morning, we aren't going back too much to work on things, because that's why we have midweek rehearsal. And then once we're done running through the songs, I always say, I look at everybody, I say, is everybody good? And they say yes. And then I say, then it's settled. That's like my catchphrase of, okay, we're good to go then. And all in all, that'll take a half an hour at the most to talk through the service, run through the songs, make sure everything's good to go musically, and then we're done. So for my team, it takes about a half an hour. So we show up at 8 o'clock, we're done by 8:30, then we have a half an hour until the service starts. So you have to think through in your own church what makes sense in terms of that. Think through, what are we trying to accomplish in our preparation time? Maybe it's just a run through of the songs. Maybe it's more involved than that. Think to yourself, how long do we need for that to happen? And then, this is the other part I haven't talked about yet. Think about, when do people at your church start showing up? Because honestly, there's nothing worse to me than when I'm still running through songs and people are showing up to church. And I don't mean that nobody can be showing up to church. I just mean like the main group of people in your church start to come in, just like quote unquote regular congregants, not somebody who's there early to do something else, but just somebody who's coming to church for that morning, and not the guy who always shows up, an hour and 15 minutes early and sits there and watches you. We can't do what we do based off of that person. But the average person in your church, when do they start coming in? For my church, it's about 8:30. That's when people start showing up. And that's why I want to be done by 8:30, because I don't want to be running through songs when they come in, because it's kind of awkward for me. I also think it's sort of unprofessional, depending on when people start showing up. If they show up 45 minutes early, that's kind of on them. But if you're still running through stuff 15 minutes before your service starts, to me, that kind of looks unprofessional. That looks like you didn't really prepare enough. You didn't care enough to show up early enough to run through the songs before people showed up. Basically, it looks like you're doing it last minute, I think. And so think through those three things. What are we trying to accomplish in that time? How long is it going to take? When do people start showing up to my church? Subtract that from when people start showing up from your church, and that will give you the time when you should show up for your sound check and your run through. Hey Spencer, our team does not have practices unless we're doing a new song or a special service at a different church. It often results in some hang-ups here and there, singers being off beat / key, etc., but nothing too major. It is a distraction for me sometimes, but it doesn't seem to bother anyone else. When I mention maybe doing weekly, bi-weekly, or even just a monthly jam session to go over certain songs or get more comfortable singing parts, I'm faced with a wall and this statement: I don't read anywhere in the Bible that the Levites had practices and rehearsals. They just sang and played from the heart, followed by a laugh and walk away. How would you handle this as a member and leader of the worship team? Everyone who leads the song that service is the worship leader, so we are all worship leaders and use input from each other when choosing songs, layout, etc. Also, I wanted to say thank you for everything that you do with your channel and answering these questions. I've had a question answered before, and it was everything I needed to hear and be able to spark thinking on how to solve the problem. Well, I'm glad I was able to help you before. It's like sometimes I read these questions and I'm about to go one way, and then you drop the bomb on me at the end of the question. Here was the bomb you dropped. You said, how would you handle this as a member or a leader of the worship team? Everyone who leads the song that service is the worship leader. So we are all worship leaders and use input from each other when choosing songs, layout, etc. And that just makes me think of the video that I put out for I guess it was my 100th episode, where I said I answered 200 worship leading questions. Here are the things that I noticed. I'll link that video down in the description below, because I'll probably talk about it even more in depth than I will in this video. But the one thing that I talked about 5 things that I saw over and over again that were problems that led to people sending in questions for Real Talk. And one of those things was that you have too many worship leaders on your team. And maybe I'm part of this problem, because you used the phrase that I wrote a whole devotional about called "We Are All Worship Leaders." And sometimes I regret naming the devotional that, even though I still stand by it, that everybody on stage is a worship leader, and so we need to function in a specific way. But that does not mean that everybody is the leader of the worship team or everybody is the leader of the worship ministry. And it sounds to me, You say everyone is a worship leader. We use input from each other when choosing songs, layout, etc. It makes me think that you don't really have a leader on your worship team and you're trying to split the duties between a bunch of people. I don't know if that's the case or not, but in the field where I said, are you a worship team leader or a worship team member? You say you're a worship team member, and it seems like you want to make worship team leader decisions even though you consider yourself a worship team member. So are you a worship team leader or are you a worship team member? Because the way we answer this is two different ways. And I think reading between the lines, it sounds like you don't have a worship team leader. You just have a bunch of musicians who are together and you're trying to figure it out. And the reason I say that is because you say, when I bring these things up about having a weekly or a bi-weekly or a monthly jam session to go over the songs, you're like, I'm met with a wall, and people just laugh at me and walk away. And you never once talk about, should I go to the worship team leader about this? And this is why I say, you can't make meaningful structural changes in your worship ministry, in the worship ministry of your church. Is not even your worship ministry at this point, because you aren't, I mean, you're a part of it, but it's not like you're the leader of it. And it sounds like nobody's the leader of it. So it's always going to be the status quo where, unless we have a consensus from the 4 or 5 people on our worship team to do something, then we're not going to be able to do it. And I point that out because you're in a tough situation. You're going to have to convince everybody on your worship team that we need to have rehearsals. And not that I don't have to do that as a worship team leader, but when you are officially the leader, people expect to look to you for guidance. And when you don't have a leader, there's nobody to look to for guidance. And you're just ruling by committee, and honestly, ruling by committee doesn't really work in the grand scheme of things. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't get input from other people and be respectful of other people's opinions and things like that. But it's been my experience that there needs to be a leader, like a point person for the worship team, not that they just rule by dictate and say, this is what we're doing and we're going to do it no matter what. They still have to pastor their team through those decisions. But at the end of the day, if you want your worship team to function well, there needs to be a person who has a vision for the worship team and has the ability to move that vision forward. And honestly, it doesn't sound like you have that. So even before I answer your question, I just want you to think about that. How do we pick somebody to lead the worship team? And this is probably a conversation you have with your pastor. We've got 5 people leading the worship team right now, and nobody really seems like they're in charge, and there's things that we need to do that we can't do. Could you give us some insight on that? Because the problems that you bring up, you say it's nothing major. There aren't that many problems with it. But if you want your worship team to grow, then there are going to be problems in the future, because you have to have a time to rehearse your songs together, or new people who come in, they're just going to be frustrated. Maybe you guys can pull this off right now because you've been playing together for a while, but the new person that comes in, they can't just walk into an unstructured band and suddenly play with you, unless they're like a really special person who just happens to click with your team in that way. But having a structure for your worship team will actually help it grow. And this is something maybe you put, I don't even know how I would do this if I'm not in charge, because it's so hard. And that's why I think you need to answer that question first. Who is in charge of the worship team? And if the answer is no one, then there's not going to be a vision for your worship team. So really, that's the problem that you need to solve. And I'll stop hitting on that point, because I don't think you're going to get anywhere just by pleading with people, please, we need to get together for worship rehearsal, when they've already made up their mind. Now, one of the things you could do is put together a solid plan for a worship rehearsal and say, this is what we expect to accomplish at our worship rehearsal. Look, I'm going to take care of it. I have a plan, and if you don't have a plan for your worship rehearsal, check out the worship rehearsal blueprint. I'll link it down in the description below. It's a 5-piece blueprint to the perfect worship rehearsal that leads your team well musically, spiritually, and relationally, so that they are prepared to lead on Sunday, grow closer to God, and grow closer to each other. Take that blueprint and you tell your team, we're going to get together for an hour and a half on Thursdays or whenever it is, and we're going to have a devotional time. We're going to have a check-in time so that we can just talk to each other and get to know each other as people. We're going to have a time of prayer. We're going to run through our songs together, and we're going to have a starting and an ending time so that we don't waste our time when we get together. If you show people that, and you say, I have a plan, and here are the things that it's going to help us accomplish, I think that would be a better way to communicate it rather than saying, here's all the problems that we have. Let's just get together and run through songs on Thursday nights. So check that out down in the description below. Other than that, until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.